Okay, I don't know which mic might be hearing me, but one of them is picking me up on this camera. So are you hearing me now? Somebody give me a shout out if you can hear. Yay! So I don't know what the deal is because I check this out every week before we start. Okay, let's see if this now. For some reason, I don't know what's wrong with the lapel mic, but it should be picking me up on. You're breaking up. I know. I just don't know what it is because I checked this all out before we started, and it all said it was working, and then all of a sudden when you go live and then it doesn't work, and then what do you do? So anyway, I don't suppose you heard any of that, but just for a review, the classes we have coming up, the Feathered Star, the class Saturday is not full, so we do have availability here in the shop as well as via Zoom. That is Saturday the 25th. And if you want to sign up for that, call the shop because we need to make sure that we have you down and you have the information you need. The class on Friday the 3rd is full of in-person seats, but the Zoom classes are available. So if that's something you'd like to do, be sure and let us know. So um, just so you know, before we start, I checked out all the cameras and all the sound. Who knows why? Then in the space of 15 minutes, it completely dies. Because according to my battery pack, I have battery power. So who knows? And I can't just turn it off and turn it back on because I have to reset everything. So we're just going to go with this. I'm assuming that you are hearing me from the from the microphone on the computer, which probably means if I stand up and go to the overhead camera, you won't hear me as well. So Katha says she's trying to lip read. So hopefully you won't have to do that too much anymore. But at least maybe you can catch on with what we're doing today. So our block for today is called Square Dance. In the description that it was a square squared project. And it is for the corner units, but these units are actually wing clipper units, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. So computer, so that will pick up the sound. Since for some reason the lapel mic has decided not to play nice. But if you are making flying geese, there are two um, color combinations of flying geese for this block. And then when you put them together, they make this chevron. So there's one set of geese that's a dark goose with light backgrounds or light sky parts. And then there's another set of geese that is a light background, that is the goose part, with the dark sky parts. So we're going to be just real quickly reviewing wing clipper instructions. I've actually already made the 4 geese that are like this, and now we're going to make 4 geese that are this combination. So you're going to need 4 small squares and 1 large square. So we've talked about this before, and I want to just review with you. If you are making whatever size geese you're making, the instructions that come with the tool tell you what size squares to cut to get the size you want. But if you'll just remember for the whatever the width of your goose is, I'm trying to get to the little chart at the top. It says start with your large square 1.5 inches larger than the width of your finished size of your goose, and start with your small squares 1 inch larger than the height of your finished goose. So that means that if your goose, this one is a 2x4 goose, so the width is 4 inches, that's my finished size. That means my large square has to be 1.5 inches bigger, so 5.5 inches For the height of my goose, which is 2 inches, my small squares have to be 1 inch larger than the height. And so that's 3 inches. Now, what I'm going to do is just kind of quick walk you through the process of how this works for stitching the geese that you need. And then we'll do as much as I can here in front of the computer so that you can still hear. I'm going to place the small square up on the top corner of my large square. And one thing with this technique, I probably did after somebody said something, but if you're using the wing clipper tool, in order for this to give you the amount of room you need to do your trimming, you want to scoot away from the corner toward the center just 2 or 3 threads. It doesn't have to be a lot, but you should see the back square on the outside edge of your smaller square. So then you're going to stitch down your lines. Oh, I forgot to talk about, you're going to just take your magic wand and draw your double lines on. And you're going to stitch, and I typically just put one of my squares on the top corner, and when I get about halfway across, I grab another square and then I overlap them. And that means the lines should line up here in the center, and I also want to leave that little bit of space at the back end of this square at this corner as well. So you're going to scoot toward the center with both squares. And you'll kind of get a feel for how much you scoot in. It's just 2 or 3 or 4 threads, just enough that you see that back square. Now, if I had not already done the geese that are this combination, I would just grab the other big square, start putting on my small blue squares, and assembly line stitch these. So we're going to just turn around and go the other way. And when we get to the other side, then we're just going to park our needle in our fabric tag. So just park the needle, and then what I'm going to do is cut right down between my lines of stitching. I've got lines dark enough that you can see my lines. Now you don't want to use your magic wand as a cutting guide, because it's not wide enough to protect your fingers. So whatever you can grab that's a little wider, gives you a little more room for your fingers, it's going to be much safer. And I am going to press toward the smaller triangle. Now I'd like to finger press just a little bit, just to give it a little bit of help, so that my seams are going the direction I want them to go before I ever put the heat of the iron on my unit. That also helps keep me from distorting my blocks. So I'm gonna try to turn my head around where you can see me and see the overhead camera and still hear me. So I know it's going to be a little fainter, but I'll try to talk loud enough that you can hear me. So I'm just going to press toward the smaller triangle and do that with both of them. If you're using the acorn pressing pin, this is when you would grab it, put just a little bit of the acorn pressing solution on there. This is basically a very simple block, but it can create some really interesting looks just by the way you place your fabric. And also what we didn't talk about is, since it's a 9 patch and we have a 12-inch finished block, each of the segments have to finish at 4 inches. The center of this block is just a plain square, and you could insert anything you wanted in there. You could even insert a square squared with whatever color combination you wanted to put there. And I'm just folding back the blue corner so that you can see what that might look like. So you can create all kinds of interesting looks just by changing the color arrangement of your pieces. So I have the first square, 2 squares sewn onto my large square. So let's come back to the needle, and I'm going to grab the other 2 small squares. And when I get those in place, again, I want to scoot away from this corner. I like to stitch from the corner out toward the middle. It's just not being nice to me today, my equipment. So I want to scoot toward what would be the center of that blue square and leave just a 2 or 3 stitches or 2 or 3 threads of this back square showing again. And I'm going to stitch right on the line. And assembly line style, when I get across one, I'm going to grab the other one and get it set up. And we're going to line that up and stitch right on to the next one. Is always more efficient if you're making several units that are the same. Even sometimes if I'm making the same unit in a different color combination, I still assembly line stitch it. The key is, if you make one mistake and you're assembly line sewing, it's possible to make several mistakes. So you do kind of have to be aware that what you're stitching is actually what you want. So once I get to the other side, I'm going to park my needle and I'm ready to take this back to the ironing surface and press again. I like to press toward the small triangle, and we're going to grab a ruler that's wide enough to protect my fingers and just cut between the stitching lines and do that again. So once I get that done, I actually have my 4 flying geese. Going to the overhead camera so you can see what I'm going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is press toward the smaller triangle. And I also finger press this so that those seams are going to lay the way I want them to lay. There are a lot of people that have started pressing these seams open. I typically don't, but you could if that's your preference. I'm just going to give those just a little bit of heat, flatten them back, and then I'm going to grab the acorn pressing pin and I typically overlap my units, so they're going to get a little extra time under the heat of the iron, which kind of makes it easier. So now I'm going to come back over here to the needle camera to do my trimming, even though it's a little bit tighter, but that way I think you can still hear me. What you're going to do is point the valley that the seams make toward you. And your wing clipper tool is going to line up, the lines on the tool line up with those seams on this unit. So this long diagonal line here is going to go on the right seam. Once I get that in place, a couple of things are going to happen. One thing is this line is going to line up with the right seam, and then the line for the appropriate size I'm trimming is going to line up on the other seam. The other thing that will happen if my goose part is very dark, or if my sky parts are very dark, those lines are going to disappear for you. I can still see them, and I'm just lining them up with my seams. Once I get that in place, I should be able to see just a tiny sliver all the way around the rectangle that is the 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangle, because that's the size I need to trim. So I'm going to trim up and over, turn 180 degrees, and then again I'm going to line up my wing clipper tool. This time the 4.5 by 2.5 inch lines are going on the 2 edges that I just cut, and then I'm going to go up the right side and over the top, and I have my perfectly trimmed goose. Now I'm going to actually do that with all 4 of my pieces. I'll do one more. And if you happen to be left-handed, simply turn your geese where they point to the right so that you lay your lines to match up with your seams pointing to the right as well. And you're going to cut up the long side and across the short side. But since I'm not left-handed, I'm not going to try that. So I'm going to again line up those 2 diagonal lines according to the size I'm making. Line that up so I can trim 2 sides, turn 180 degrees. And again, I'm going to trim across the short side first and then the long side. Now, the really nice thing about the way we trim this, it leaves me with the exact seam allowance I need at the tip so that I don't worry about chopping off my goose's beak. Now, the reason I wanted to go ahead and make some of these is because I want to show you how I stitched them together and where you need to press, what you need to press toward. So I've got two that are the darker goose, and I have two that are the lighter goose, and see how those line up to make those chevrons. So I'm going to stitch, I'm going to flip the lighter goose and the darker wings, or the darker sky, so that it's on top. Because when I stitch through, I want to be able to see that intersection where the two lines of stitching. And again, I've got light thread. So I'm just going to put a little X there with my pen so you can see what I'm looking at. I'm looking at that intersection where the two lines of stitching, this seam and this seam, where they cross. So when I stitch across here, I want to hit that intersection. That's going to give me that perfect point that I'm after. And I'm just going to line these up. Now, if you are a pinner, if you like to pin, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to pin one of them and not the other one, because I will tell you, I don't pin on this particular step. But if you feel the need to pin, you want to line up your pieces. And I've got my two raw edges together, and I'm just sliding my pin kind of at an angle so that I can make sure they stay together. If I push my pin in straight like this and then twist it, I automatically shift the top layer this way, and I don't want to do that. If you are pinning right here for that intersection to stay put, you again just kind of glide it in at an angle, and then it makes it easier to keep in place. Now, if I've trimmed perfectly, if I've stitched perfectly, this is going to be a 1/4 inch from the edge. And I'm using my 1/4 inch patchwork foot. So that being said, if you are new to quilting and you've not found any information that tells you that typical quilting seams are 1/4 inch seams, would be really surprised. There are a lot of patterns that assume we know that, but if you have come from garment sewing, we typically use a 5/8 inch seam. That's too wide for quilting, and that's not what quilting patterns are designed around. So you want to make sure that the seam allowance you're using is the appropriate seam allowance. I happen to have a patchwork foot on, so that means that as my fabric rides right along the edge of the foot, that should be my 1/4 inch. So you still want to check that out, especially if you're using a machine that you're new to or not as familiar with. You want to check out to make sure that your seam allowance is that 1/4 inch that you're looking for. And there's some patterns that they'll say you want a scant 1/4 inch. Who really knows what that means? So I like this technique with Deb's tools because you just use a 1/4 inch. And then you don't have the issue. Now look what happened. Because I sewed right across that intersection, I have that perfect point that I was looking for. So when you press the geese that you've stitched together, you want to press in the direction the geese are flying. My geese in this case are flying north, the way I'm holding my units. So I'm just going to press toward the top goose. And like I said, there are some people these days that are starting to press open. If you like to do that, that's perfectly fine. I tend to press to the side if I can because I find it to be faster. And notice I did not pin this time. I get started and I keep my needle in the down position so I can make sure that if I manipulate this fabric, I'm not disturbing the fabric that's underneath my needle. And I can get to that intersection and just hold it with my fingers. Sometimes I have to adjust the presser foot so it won't scoot the fabric along and get a little lump there. When I get to the other end, of course, if I was doing all 4 of the units, I would do assembly line sewing. but I didn't trim all of my geese, so I can only do 2 of them right now. But that way you can see kind of how that works. So there's my second one. And yes, I have that perfect point that I'm after. And that's what you want. So we're going to go over to the iron so you can see how that is pressed. Now I can't find my mouse. Hang on. There it is. Okay, so we're going to press the direction the geese are flying. So I'm going this direction, and I just give it a little nudge with my iron while it's getting heated. Then I get the next one ready. And like I said, I stack them a lot of times. And I also finger press just to make sure all of my seams are going the way I want them to. And now I'm going to grab my acorn pressing pin, give it just a little sweep across there, just to help flatten that seam out. Once you get 4 of those units done, you have the 4 side units of your block. So it will go right there. All right, so we're going to talk about the square squared tool. And I'm going to come over to the other camera just so you can see and hear as well as possible. So on the square squared unit, we're after a specific measurement from point to point. But that often means that the measurement from side to side for the square that we need to cut is an odd measurement that's not really on a traditional ruler. So mathematically, this would need to be 4 times 1.414 and then add your seam allowance. Now, I don't want to do that. And with this tool, you don't have to. What happens with a lot of designers is they give us the closest number they can to the measurement that that square needs to be. And generally it's pretty close, but it's not as accurate as I like. So I like this method where one end of my tool is actually a window template for that center. So I have several different size options here. We're doing the 4-inch finished block. So that window is what I'm going to cut for my square squared unit. And I've got a whole strip here. If you're doing a bunch of square squares of the same size, it's more efficient to have a strip because I can cut several of them at a time. If I'm just doing one of these, I would probably cut a square about the size I need plus a little bit, so I can true up that square and get the size I want. With this particular block, I've given you instructions for cutting a strip. And if you cut the length it says, you'll have plenty of room to cut all 4 centers. So all I have to do is put this on here, and I'm going to cut up and across because this strip is just a bit wider than my measurement for the actual size I need. Then I'm just going to twist it around and put my 4-inch, my center square for 4-inch blocks on my strip right here where I cut at the base, right here where I cut. And when I make this cut, now I've got 2 precisely cut squares for the center. Then I'm going to do the same thing. Now, if I hadn't disturbed my strip, I should be able to, I think I can anyway. If you've got plenty of room on your cutting surface, just line up the lines again. Here goes the line on the base, a line on the edge. So all I have to do is cut up and over. And that gives me my center squares. Excuse me. So now I have 4 center squares. I can get rid of that, except I moved my little collector. So there are my 4 squares for my center. I'm just going to stack them here for a minute. On this tool, there's also something else that will help me, because right on the side of this A section where it describes what I need to cut in the different sizes, it tells me if I am making a 4-inch finished unit, I'm going to cut 3 1/4 inch squares, and I'm going to cut them in half. It gives me measurements for all these sizes, so I know that I'm making 4-inch finished units. So I have a stack of 3 1/4 inch squares. And actually I have a couple of different colors, because notice that this has 3 triangles that are my background color and 1 triangle that is a different color. So I've got my dark blue up in the corner. Every square is going to give me 2 triangles to go around my squares. So since I have 4 squares that need that 1 dark triangle, I have 2 squares to fill my my triangles for the corners. So I'm just going to line that up corner to corner. I'm not measuring anything because I've already measured with the size squares I cut, and there are my triangles for the corners. For the background squares, I'm going to stack these where they're a little bit tidier because they've gotten shifted and they're not straight. Let's just do that and make sure. So I have to have 1 square for every 2 triangles I need. So for this block, you're going to need 6 background squares, or whatever color you want for that position. So I'm just going to cut all of those in half, corner to. And this is review for those of you who have done the square squared before. I'm going to show you real quick too the chart for that. Although the chart kind of gives you the process, but all of your sizing information is right on this tool. It tells me if I want a center square for a 4-inch finished block, I need to start with 3 1/2 inch strips. For the sizing triangles, there's my chart. So all of that information is right on your tool. But this kind of gives you a quick reference for how you put the triangles on and what you line up to trim with. And we'll be doing that in just a second. So I am going to take one of my squares, and on this unit I need to have 1 corner that's this blue triangle and 3 corners that are the background color. So that's what I'm going to do. But I'm going to actually do this in opposite sides. So I'm going to put a blue corner and a background corner opposite each other. And if you stitch with the square on top, you're going to be more accurate. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the square is cut to the size it's going to stay. Nothing's going to get trimmed off of this square. It is going to get trimmed off of the triangle. So if you put that on bottom, you can keep track of your square a little better. The other thing is, if there's any issues, the feed dogs on your machine will help feed through that triangle, and you can keep track of your square that way. So I'm lined up right with my 1/4 inch patchwork foot. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you're going to need to, in some way, figure out what your 1/4 inch measurement is, mark your machine, or get a foot that has that measurement. A lot of the machines that are being sold now, they have you move your needle over so that the edge of your presser foot, whatever that edge is, becomes your 1/4 inch measurement. If your machine has a manufactured patchwork foot, you're going to be happier with that measurement. So now there's my first triangle, and I'm just going to finger press it back out of my way. I'm just going to do one of them so that you can kind of get the process down. Then I'm going to grab one of my background triangles, and I'm going to stitch it on the other side. Again, I want my square on top, my triangle on bottom, because it feeds through better that way. Also, you're feeding through a bias edge on the triangle, but a straight edge on the square. So that's also another reason for stitching with the square on top and the triangle on bottom. That was probably the hardest thing for me to get into the habit of doing, because I was used to putting the square on bottom and the triangle on top. And you've probably had patterns that gave you what they were calling precise measurements, and they would say fold the square and find the center, and fold the triangle and find the center and match them up. You don't have to do that. You're just going to center that triangle on there, and you just want to make sure that you have about an equal amount of that little ear sticking out on both ends. That's going to get trimmed, but you want it to be fairly consistent so that you don't end up with one side that has a whole bunch and one side that's really kind of a squeaker and hard to get what you need. So once you get this far in the process, it's going to be faster to just grab your iron and press that. I'm just going to do that without changing cameras so that you know that it's laying down nice and flat. And then you're going to grab two more background triangles. This one's going to go on this side, this one will go on this side, and again, stitch from the square on top. And that way you can see that I have about an equal amount of that little triangle ear sticking out on both sides. And I start with my needle and a fabric tag that just kind of helps feed the fabric through, and I'm not so likely to have my machine eat the corners of my triangles. And I'm just going to stitch right on across and park your needle. Now, of course, I would be doing all four of these assembly line style, but since I'm just going to stitch one for you today, I'll just park my needle and get ready to do the other side. So as long as I'm not trapping down this point, I don't even have to press this back before I add this one. I can just flip it over, and I want to just center it on there, and I just do it by eye. I don't have to fuss with it to try to get it to be straight. And I'm lining up the top square with the edge of my 1/4-inch patchwork foot. And then park my needle, and I'm ready to press. And this time I'm going to try to talk loud enough that you can hear me and actually do my trimming on the overhead camera, because I think you'll be able to see better. So my first step is to press those last two triangles. And I do finger press them so that I don't distort that center. Finger press those, and then I'm going to grab my iron, give it just a little time under the heat, and if you're using the acorn pressing pin, now's the time. I give it a little swipe, set the iron on it, and give the other side the acorn solution. Now I'm ready to trim. And I love the way this trims, because all I have to look for is all of the X's that match the number of the size I want to cut. So I'm making a 4-inch finished unit. So all I have to do is find the X's that say 4. There are 4 of them, and I put 1 X on each intersection, and I just center my unit under all of those number 4s, or whatever size you're making, and then you just tweak it till the lines, the diagonal lines, line up with your seams. Once you get that done, you're ready to trim. We're going to trim up, over. If you are left-handed, you're just going to hold your ruler vertically like this. I'm kind of holding my ruler at an angle, and I'm standing at an angle, so I figure you can hear me a little better. We're going to line this up. Line up all the number 4s on all the intersections. I also am checking to make sure that the 4.5-inch line on the base is where I want it, so I end up with a 4.5-inch square. And that automatically ensures that I am left with the seam allowance I need right at those intersections, so that the next seam that goes across hits that intersection and I end up with the precise points I'm after. So when I get ready to put this together, I would make sure that I have all of my blue corners pointing to the center square. So, like I've said before, you don't have to put your block together the same way I put my block together. You could actually take these chevrons, twist them around, and create a different block. Put this a little closer so you can see what happens if I turn these chevrons around. So you can see it creates another star. Oops, I already had that one backward or turned. It creates another star in the center. And I can actually see that easier on the camera than I can standing right over this and looking at it. Sometimes it's easier to see the design you're making by stepping back just a little bit. Just imagine what this would have looked like if on this goose, where I had the dark center, I had the dark center and the background sky parts. What if I'd put a light blue there? I would have ended up with a light blue star in the center, and that was an easy way to create a double star. You could also turn these around, create a completely different look just by turning your corners. So you have lots of options for how you put your block together. You don't have to arrange your units the same way I do. But if you want yours to look like the picture of the block that you get in your handouts, then you'll want to arrange them the way I have. And that's how your cutting instructions and your fabric requirements are listed, so that makes a little more sense. So other than sound issues, do we have any questions or comments I need to deal with? I see a lot of hello, Pam, and hello from Georgia, and I know there's several people here in Northwest Arkansas, several people in Florida, and we're always happy to have everyone join us for our sew along. And so next week we'll be doing, let me tell you the number. It is, oh my goodness, I can't even get it. 23, block 23. We're not necessarily doing all of them in order, so that's why I wasn't sure to tell you 23. So between now and next week, I will finish the block, and it'll be on the wall behind me. And you can go to the link to find the patterns for the block. If you don't get emails from us with the block instructions and would like to, just give me a message or give us a call and we'll add you to the list. So until next week, happy sewing. Come and see us if you are in the area.